Rick Longinotti, co-chair of the Campaign for Sustainable Transportation. So I'm going to talk about the conference themes and also how those themes relate to our work in the campaign. So I'm thinking that, you know, in our region here in San Francisco, the inequalities go way back, and based on transportation. This is Telegraph Hill. You know, back in the day, I read some novel a long time ago in which they described the people that lived on Telegraph Hill with the poorest people living at the top of the hill. And I thought to myself, oh my God, has that ever changed around? And it was on account of transportation, because, you know, walking-based transportation, it was harder to get up the hill and lug all your stuff. Anybody walk up the hill here today? You know what I'm talking about. This is San Francisco, Market Street, 1905. There's my grandmother in the foreground. Not really, but it could have been. She lived south of Market, so it could have been. Anyway, this is a street scene that has, you know, some streetcar over to the right of the picture, but nevertheless, it was still a pedestrian-dominated street scene, and there was a certain equality in that. Rich and poor alike walked. Then when you get to the automobile revolution, that all changes. And so you must now own an automobile to get around, and pedestrians are at a disadvantage. So our Santa Cruz scene here, we have streetcars, first horse-drawn streetcars on Pacific Avenue, and then what we see here is electric. And that meant that there was certain kinds of growth that happened. You know, the Santa Cruz, like other places, you know, the growth occurred around transit corridors, and this is way before zoning or planners or planning departments, and but it just happened naturally that there was a dense development based on walking and proximity to the streetcar. You had villages. You know, I passed through today, you know, Capitola Village, and passed by Soquel Village, and Aptos Village is a little farther down the road. So we had villages. Well, at least the first couple were connected by a streetcar. So here's a turning point, 1924, when Santa Cruz, like many other communities around the country, switched out their streetcars for buses. And this had, you know, really potent implications for land use, because, well, the automobile revolution had that. The transition to buses was a result of that. But all of a sudden now, with automobiles, we could have properties developed that were in remote locations, and people could still get to them. And we're still seeing that today. We're seeing that, you know, developers who are buying properties based on their costs, they're inexpensive properties where they're not necessarily located near a transit corridor, which would be a more opportune location for a large development. So we have now a new inequality, a new poverty or mobility. We've had poverty for as long as cities have been around, but the inequalities based on transportation have been exacerbated. So here's a little chart of Watsonville, when you have about a third of the people who don't drive and are then dependent on other people to get them around. And I like this quote from the Master Transportation Study in the city of Santa Cruz, which is around 2003. Choice is also about giving people freedom and independence to be responsible to take care of their own needs, whether children, seniors, or disabled, without being dependent or needing assistance from someone who can drive. So we've had planners who've had these ideas for years, 2003, and we're still aspiring to enact them, right? So we have the impact of the auto revolution on our health. In Watsonville ranks very high on the list of cities of comparable size in terms of the number of injuries to pedestrians. We have in the county Latino children who are more obese than white children. And some of that certainly might be due to automobile dependency. So we have, you know, as you all know, the price of housing has resulted in longer and longer commutes. We have 15% of the people who work in Santa Cruz coming from outside the county, and then we have a big exodus from the county to other areas to go to work, as people can make more money if they travel over to the Bay Area. And so this is by way of making it the case that if you're interested in transportation justice, you're interested in affordable housing near where people work. We don't have the statistics for Santa Cruz, but we do have it for San Francisco and Riverside, comparing the costs of housing plus transportation as a percentage of income, and San Francisco comes out better in spite of the enormous cost of housing there, because in Riverside County there's just a huge portion of people's incomes that goes towards transportation, and that's auto dependency. So something that we don't recognize all the time is the cost of auto dependency on our social life, our family life, and actually Robert Putnam, who studies this thing called social capital, is the connectedness that people have with each other, the rate at which they are active in their community in the PTA, or the rate that they go to a civic meeting or whatever. He measures those things, and he finds that the longer the commute, the less you're involved in your community. This is one of the neighborhoods that you heard the term food desert, referring to parts of Detroit and so forth. Well, this is really a food desert. The Prospect Heights neighborhood, which is cut off from the rest of the city by Highway 1, it does have a school and a couple churches and a dog park. But in terms of amenities, you really need to cross the freeway if you want to get anywhere. And that includes, all those groups of people that I talked about who don't drive. So children, if you are on a bike, you have to cross the highway on that Morrissey overpass, which I don't recommend that you let your children do that. I've done that many times. So our organization, the Campaign for Sustainable Transportation, this is our vision. We were called the Campaign for Sensible Transportation, and we dropped that name sensible. It was kind of arrogant. We thought that if we're sensible, then what is everybody else? So we actually chose sustainable because it does have a definition. This is from basically a version of the Brandt Commission's definition. Sustainable meaning meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's based on the idea that there are limits to nature, right? That we damage the future generations when we exceed those limits. So this is also part of our vision statement, that we support land use decisions that encourage compact development rather than sprawl. We have a sustainable Santa Cruz County plan, and we'll be talking about that today. We support affordable housing near jobs. And we support making streets and pathways safe for pedestrians and bicyclists to reduce serious injuries and also to foster more daily exercise, reduce greenhouse gases, and all that. So we have this I'm going to plug the afternoon's workshops. Peter Bennett is here from the city of San Jose, who is designing the bike lanes that are going in San Jose, where in the downtown, where they're going up all over the place, and they're doing it in a model fashion for the rest of us to imitate, because they're doing it inexpensively in a so-called quick build fashion, where they're using a lot of plastic bollards and such as a temporary measure before they get to sort of the permanent barriers that cost more money. But that's something that I just hope we can emulate here. In fact, a lot of these ideas that will come up today, I'm hoping that we kind of change our mindset from like, hey, aren't we great and the rest of the country should imitate us, to maybe we can learn from other places. We support good transit and active transportation infrastructure, and we have a panel on that today. So Jeff Wood from the Overhead Wire, he does a radio show in which he interviews countless people about transit and urban planning issues. And Sally Arnold's here, and Brand Friedman will be here, and also Ray Consino from the Community Bridges. They'll be talking about the fact that, our metro ridership has gone down, whereas you have it in other places like Boulder that has gone way up. Why is that? What can we do to get to the next level? So the Campaign for Sustainable Transportation is really trying to answer this question. How do we close the gap between our climate and justice goals and our transportation and land use policies. One of the gap features, one of the prominent features is the expansion plan. The Regional Transportation Commission policy remains, it's been this way since 2004 and before that, to expand Highway 1 to 8 lanes. As you look at this artist rendering, doesn't it make you want to just heave a sigh of relief, like, no more congestion? And actually, congestion relief is the motivator for the project, and we all think that's a good idea, to reduce congestion, reduce those lengthy commutes that cost our community so much. But in fact, it doesn't work in actual practice. We have enough evidence now from around the country and the world to know that lanes fill up again with traffic. So we did invite Susan Handy to Santa Cruz. She was commissioned by the California Air Resources Board to study the studies on highway expansion and to find out their impact on congestion relief and reduce greenhouse gases. And she found that highways fill back up again, and in some studies there was sort of a one-to-one correspondence. One extra lane on the highway, if it's a 50% increase in highway capacity, you get a 50% increase in traffic. So you end up back where you started. It's called induced travel. People make decisions about relocating. Oh, the highway to Watsonville is now opened up again. I work in Silicon Valley. Hey, maybe I'll buy a house in Watsonville because now it's a relief. So people make different decisions, and that impacts traffic. The Caltrans studied this plan to widen the highway. By the way, in this view, you'll see that there's this feature plan involves doubling the width of the highway. So right now we have 2 lanes in each direction. There would be an HOV lane, the 2 through lanes, and then an auxiliary lane on the right shoulder. So the EIR on the HOV lane project predicted an increase in vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gases, and these were most likely underestimated because the Caltrans EIR did not account for induced travel, this phenomenon of highways filling back up again. So if the HOV lane project will not relieve congestion, why is it still the RTC's goal? We have an answer for that. We have RTC members here. But so Jarrett Walker's kind of a rock star in the transit planner world. He was speaking about another community, or other communities in general, not about Santa Cruz, when he said, parties who will profit from further development in a corridor may be part of the political consensus in support of a road expansion, even as the same expansion is marketed to existing residents as a congestion-reducing project. So the Measure D, which was on the ballot in 2016, was marketed to voters as congestion reduction, and actually the RTC spent $100,000 or more, over $100,000 on a mailer. Before it got the name Measure D, they spent this on a mailer going to every voter in the county, promising congestion relief on Highway 1. The problem with the promise of congestion relief, whether it's an extra lane on a highway or a new train that goes down the rail corridor parallel to the highway, is we can't promise that and be authentic. Because as Susan Handy told us in that workshop in 2016, when you reduce traffic on anything that reduces traffic on the highway, is subject to this induced travel effect. So if we do a transit program that pull drivers off of the highway, now they're on a bus or now they're on a train, other people are going to take their place, particularly in a situation like ours when there's a pent-up demand for travel. And we have a lot of pent-up demand because we have this huge job center over the hill in Silicon Valley with people looking for housing that's moderately cheaper in our county. So the pent-up demand will express itself. So it's disingenuous to promise congestion relief, and we're educating ourselves about that, because some of us who are alternative transportation advocates are saying, hey, well, this will, it's better to, do a transit on the rail corridor because it will reduce congestion. No, it won't. But there are other reasons to do it. And when George Giandero, who was the director of the RTC at the time that Susan came, he came to the workshop and he said, Susan, what do we tell all the people that are stuck in traffic on Highway 1? And she said, give them alternatives. So we're not promising congestion relief because it'll come back, but we can promise alternatives for at least some of those people who are able to take a transit, bus-only lane on Highway 1, or some kind of transit on the rail corridor, something like that. So we know that back to the subject of marketing the Measure D as a congestion relief measure, we had a lot of construction interests who were backing that, and from outside the county primarily. So there truly is a highway lobby in the state of California, and our second workshop, we'll hear about that. This is our 11:15 workshop. Christopher Escarcega from Climate Plan, which is a state group that's trying to close the gap between state goals for reducing our carbon footprint and our actual practice. Benjamin Eichert from Green Power, who will talk about the very exciting developments in the Green New Deal, and Francisco Estrada, the Watsonville mayor, right in the heart of where we need to make improvements. So a word about the Highway 1 Environmental Impact Report. It was begun in 2014. It's cost over $14 million at this point. It named the HOV lane project as the preferred alternative, and that's because the other alternative that was examined, the so-called TSM alternative, would result in very slight improvement in traffic congestion. So it didn't compare favorably, and that was one reason why the RTC named the HOV project as the preferred alternative. The third alternative that was looked at was the no-build alternative. Now, the alternatives that were not examined include these: the bus on the shoulder of the highway, transit on the rail corridor, or an improved transit network. And this third one, I just want to read this quote from Jarrett Walker. He said to the RTC at a meeting in 2018, "We know that simply a higher level of service would be useful to a lot more people and would be having a lot more benefit, particularly in the Santa Cruz-Watsonville corridor." So these three alternatives, or others, were not studied by Caltrans in their plan for Highway 1 HOV lanes. And the state law, CEQA, requires the analysis of alternatives, right? And so that's the basis of a lawsuit that the Campaign for Sustainable Transportation and the Sierra Club are prosecuting now with Caltrans. We're asking that they analyze a range of alternatives that includes transit. It's not such a David and Goliath struggle, however, because actually Caltrans just lost a lawsuit down in San Diego County, and our attorney, William Parkin, has also successfully sued Caltrans in Santa Barbara County. So we're hopeful, and you can be a part of that because we need to raise money for the attorney's fees. We're needing to raise $56,000. So any amount towards that would help. Thank you. Yeah, so that's the recent, this was just from October 2nd. Caltrans made a settlement down in abandoning, actually the High Desert Freeway project is in LA County, or parts of it anyway, in LA County. So another thing that we're working on in the campaign is the parking garage issue in the city of Santa Cruz. Why we are opposed to it is because it's perpetuating auto dependency. It's drawing away funding from other priorities, and it diminishes the public realm to have a monstrous parking structure where it reduces the walkability in the downtown and draws more traffic into the downtown. So we're all extending to you an invitation to come to a happy hour on this coming Thursday at Lupolo, which is a celebration of alternatives to building this new parking structure. So our group was the main group advocating for bus passes for everybody who worked in the downtown, and we were successful in that. So let's have a hand about that. Thank you. So this is a question for the city, for any city, but now for the city of Santa Cruz. Can a city trying to pay a 30-year debt on a garage afford to encourage commuters not to park? Well, who's going to pay for the garage if people are not parking? So they're working in both directions. as Kurt pointed out to the Downtown Association the other day. I would propose to you that this parking structure has already cost us, nearly cost us, in terms of incentives for commuters, because there was 3 votes against the bus pass proposal on the city council. And why? I'm speculating here, but I'm thinking that there's money going to the metro, which is $500,000. Well, it's $500,000 for the whole program, which includes jump bike credit and other incentives and marketing for this program. But $500,000 a year, $3 million a year that would go to the garage, and pretty soon you start to have those dollars compete for each other. There is an affordable housing argument for the garage. We need a new garage so if new affordable housing developments don't need to build parking on site. And this is a very good idea that new affordable housing developments don't need to build parking on site. But do we need a new garage to satisfy that requirement? Because these photos will show you that and this is the peak, one of the peak times of the year for parking in the downtown, where people are going out to eat with their children who are graduating. These are shots from the 3 main garages downtown, and you can imagine that even those cars empty out by the end of the night, and people can park overnight. And we don't need 600 more parking spaces, in other words, to provide parking for new affordable developments downtown. The consultants that spoke to the city, this was in 2015, they recommended a series of measures to reduce parking demand, mainly having to do with price and these kinds of rewards like transit passes. They also importantly recommended a reform of parking requirements in the downtown for new development. So new development requires, in fact, Ria Hudabar-Loh, who's in the top photo there from Nelson Nygaard, she said to the city planners and commissioners, she said, I looked at your parking requirements and they look like they were written in the 1960s. So communities around the country are reducing parking requirements. And the important part of this, and I hope the affordable housing advocates in the audience here will join our group in pressing for this, is to unbundle the cost of parking from the cost of a new unit. And that would look something like this, where you could opt out of the parking if you didn't have a car, which includes lots of people these days, especially if it's in a downtown where the amenities are all around and you have good transit. That would pass the savings from reduced parking requirements onto the consumer. The City Council had a study session of March of this year featuring Patrick Siegman. And Siegman was an employee of Nelson Nygaard who actually conducted the study of parking for downtown Santa Cruz. And his results were that there was in the 2020s, there's going to be a surplus of parking, in spite of the fact that there would be new development downtown, and in spite of the fact that there'll be a loss of parking in surface parking lots. So his recommendations have not really caught traction, even in spite of the fact that the city spent money on this. There was a $100,000 contract for Nelson Nygaard to produce this study, but the city's prefers to listen to their staff, which are predicting a parking shortage in the 2020s. They also heard from Professor Adam Miller-Ball from UCSC, who was also an employee at Nelson Nygaard some years ago. And he just reminded the council members of the cost of the garage and how it would be way cheaper to pay people not to park. They also heard from the city attorney, who said that excess parking revenues could be put into the general fund, and what this means, the significance of this is that the library, which needs more money in order to get everything that they want to remodel their library on site, would need more money. And that's why we're calling this a win-win, because if you don't build the parking garage, you save $87 million over the 30-year period. And a portion of that could go to the library to help it do its thing. these are some artists. We've been inviting artists to imagine, a commons where the farmers market currently meets. So make that a permanent home to the farmers market and have other events there as well. This is, and here's a dystopian vision of of the downtown with the public library underneath. Actually, this painting is an exaggeration. There's one less level of parking than this painting depicts. And here's the more utopian vision by the same artist, Russ Bruchet. So there's another thing that we're working on to close this gap between our goals and our policies, and it has to do with our planning. So this was a beautiful plan that was put together and completed in 2014 with the primary goal of reducing greenhouse gases, and it proposed to do that by concentrating development along transit corridors. They noticed that there was a jobs housing imbalance, and they wanted to address that by making these activity nodes. You see where the circles are, those are activity nodes where you would have jobs, workplaces, you would have amenities so people could go out to eat for lunch, right in the same thing without having to get in a car. You'd have some housing on the surrounding that. So nice plan, has not been adopted yet, 2014. Here's another part of the vision where there would be some bus prioritization and also protected bike lanes. We're going to hear later about protected bike lanes. Lo and behold, we have a proposal for a Nissan dealership to go right smack in one of those activity centers. And this is not consistent with this plan. It's not even consistent with the general plan that's already been adopted. So it requires a general plan amendment. And you had the Board of Supervisors vote to approve this already. They have to vote again because there was a successful lawsuit on the EIR. So that's coming up very soon. And even worse, there's a proposal for a Kaiser facility, 15-minute walk from the nearest bus line. And the idea that you could just move the bus over there or detour the bus to go run by the Kaiser facility would really decimate that bus line. It's the one that runs along the Capitol Hill Road. You just don't do that if we need to be thinking about locating development along transit corridors, not to try to move the bus to where the development happens, where they happen to find cheap available land. So Kaiser, our organization's trying to engage with Kaiser because their mission is health, right? They're about helping us thrive, and maybe they haven't connected the dots yet, so we need to help them out. So there's a question I think about when we do these corridors plans. Are people really believing that that good planning can help? And I just want to bring up one example. In Stanford, under the leadership of Brody Hamilton, they eliminated any increase in vehicle trips to campus during a 14-year period when the campus grew by 5,000 commuters. The question is, why did they do that? Well, they did that because they had to, because the county of Santa Clara said you cannot grow unless you do that. And you have to measure what the car trips are now, and you have to measure them every year, and they did. And they succeeded. And how did they do that? They followed the advice of those planners. They rewarded people for not driving solo to campus, literally paying them, and they made it easy transit-wise. Another example, quickly, Boulder, Colorado, which you saw, they more than doubled their transit ridership. It's because they made a political decision, and that's where you all come in. It's about providing our community with the impetus, to make a change in our priorities. So the last gap that we're working on is our Vision Zero, which is this international movement to achieve zero serious injuries on account of traffic, whether it's car collisions or car, bike, or car pedestrian. Santa Cruz County badly needs this, as our statistics show us. The injuries and deaths are disproportionately in low-income neighborhoods. The city of Santa Cruz now has a plan to expand this intersection. There's already 8 lanes coming into the city on Highway 1. There's 5 lanes on River Street going north. They want to add to that, more turn lanes, expanding this intersection. It's a very, very expensive proposition. $8.5 million is the estimate. It would cost $4.7 million in local money. Our traffic impact fee last balance was less than what it's going to cost. So it's draining money that could go for other things, and that's the tragedy of this project. Not only does it probably subject to induced travel once again, where more traffic shows up, but it's taking money away from other things that we need. So we're going to have an effort to identify dangerous streets in the city of Santa Cruz, and that's where you come in, is to help us out. We'll pass out clipboards at some point, and you can identify in your neighborhoods where you would not feel safe sending a 10-year-old child to ride on his or her bike, or intersections that are difficult for pedestrians. So I want to, at this time, introduce our next speaker. So Sibley Simon is a developer of affordable housing, and he's done it in an innovative way. He was a tech entrepreneur who got inspired by the fact that the homeless issue where he was volunteering, is related to the lack of affordable housing. So he noticed that the state and federal funds for affordable housing were drying up, and there was not much being built, and so he has innovated another way. So he will talk about that. But he'll also talk about an answer to a question that I asked him, is like, how do we get the affordable housing that we need in our community?